There are moments in history when power does not announce itself with explosions or armies, but with silence so complete that it terrifies those who hear it. During the Cold War, while the world watched parades of missiles and listened to speeches filled with threats, the United States chose a different language, one spoken at 80,000 feet, at 3 times the speed of sound, far above the reach of fear, ideology, or retaliation. It was a language of absolute confidence, born from engineering brilliance and strategic audacity, and it told a single unmistakable story. America did not need permission to see the world. It simply did. The creation of the SR-71 Blackbird ** was not merely a technological achievement. It was a declaration of dominance so complete that its enemies could only react, never respond. By the time the Cold War drew to a close, the SR-71 had done more than gather intelligence. It had reshaped the psychological landscape of global power. It taught a generation of adversaries that there were levels of technological mastery they could not reach, no matter how much they invested or how urgently they tried. For the United States, the Blackbird became a symbol of what happens when vision, resources, and courage align. For its rivals, it remained an unanswered question written across the sky, one that still has no solution. As years passed, the humiliation hardened into doctrine. Interceptor squadrons trained specifically for a target they would never catch. Missile crews practiced launches that history proved futile. New aircraft like the MiG-25 were rushed into service, celebrated publicly as answers to Western reconnaissance. In private, officers knew the truth. Even at their theoretical limits, these machines could not close the gap with a Blackbird already at cruise. Each failed attempt reinforced a silent hierarchy in the sky. The Americans operated at a level that did not require escalation. They simply observed, collected, and departed. The SR-71's continued survival turned it into something more than an aircraft. It became a moving boundary, redefining what secure airspace meant. When it flew, it announced without words that American technology had already anticipated every known countermeasure. This realization shaped Soviet strategy in subtle but profound ways, diverting resources, accelerating programs, and fueling paranoia about what else the United States might possess beyond public knowledge. The Blackbird did not just gather intelligence. It extracted confidence from its adversaries, flight after flight. What made these missions psychologically crushing for Soviet defenders was not only the aircraft's performance, but its predictability. The Blackbird did not behave like a thief in the night. It arrived on time, flew its profile, and left on schedule. Routines formed around it. Radar stations anticipated the blip. Interceptor bases prepared scrambles they knew would fail. Command posts rehearsed responses that history had already rendered symbolic. The humiliation lay in repetition. Each successful pass reinforced the same conclusion. American planners understood Soviet defenses better than the Soviets themselves. The sky became a classroom, and every flight a lesson delivered without mercy. Inside the cockpit, the experience was paradoxical. The aircraft felt most alive at the edge of the possible, humming with heat and speed. Its systems working in concert at Mach 3. Pilots learned every vibration, every tremor, every subtle change in sound. They knew that if something went wrong, it would announce itself instantly. Emergency lights were not suggestions. They were verdicts. Yet this intimacy with the machine bred confidence. The Blackbird was demanding, but it was honest. When it was healthy, it was sovereign, and most of the time it was healthy. The very fact that the greatest danger came from physics rather than enemy action became a quiet affirmation of superiority. The Soviets responded the only way they could, by trying to catch up. Interceptors were refined, radar coverage expanded, missile envelopes recalculated. Aircraft like the MiG-31 were designed with the explicit goal of countering high-speed intruders at extreme altitude. On briefing slides, the equations finally closed. In the sky, they did not. The window of opportunity remained too small, the reaction chain too slow. By the time an intercept solution formed, the Blackbird was already beyond it, accelerating into thinner air where options collapsed to zero. Every failure deepened the psychological scar. This was not a contest of bravery or numbers. It was a contest of foresight, and the Americans had arrived years earlier. Even accidents, when they occurred, reinforced the imbalance. When crews were forced to eject due to mechanical failures, recovery efforts were swift and disciplined. The aircraft might be lost, but not to enemy fire. The distinction mattered. For Soviet strategists, it meant that despite thousands of attempts, despite billions invested, the ultimate proof of success, a shoot-down, never came. The Blackbird denied them that validation. It denied them a moment of triumph. It denied them closure. When the aircraft was finally retired, the reaction was telling. There was no opposing celebration, no declaration that the sky had been reclaimed. The Blackbird exited history the same way it had entered contested airspace by choice, on its own terms, undefeated. Its legacy endured not in wreckage or trophies, but in decades of frustrated alarms and unanswered questions. For those who watched it cross their screens and vanish, it left behind a single enduring realization. The contest had never been equal, and the sky had proven it. What followed was a widening gap between perception and reality on the Soviet side. Publicly, new interceptors and missile systems were unveiled as answers to Western reconnaissance. Privately, analysts understood that these solutions arrived too late to matter. Even when intercept geometries appeared promising on paper, real-world constraints, engine performance, climb rates, sensor fusion delays collapsed the solution window. The Blackbird did not need to maneuver aggressively or evade dramatically. It simply maintained course and speed, allowing physics to do the work. Each mission thus became a quiet demonstration of American foresight. Problems anticipated years earlier, solved before the adversary fully understood them. The presence of the SR-71 Blackbird *** reshaped daily life inside Soviet air defense units in ways that rarely appeared in public histories. Scramble protocols evolved around a target everyone knew would not be caught. Sirens wailed, crews ran, engines ignited, and aircraft clawed for altitude with disciplined urgency, not because victory was expected, but because ritual demanded response. Over time, this ritual became corrosive. Pilots understood that their role had shifted from defenders to witnesses, participants in a theater whose ending never changed. Each launch consumed fuel, airframe life, and morale. Each recovery returned aircraft and crews intact, but diminished by repetition. The Blackbird turned readiness itself into a burden, forcing the Soviet system to expend energy on a problem it could neither solve nor ignore. In a conflict defined by endurance, that drain mattered. This culture of compelled reaction produced a subtle but lasting psychological asymmetry. American planners could choose when to fly, where to fly, and how often to fly, calibrating missions for maximum informational gain with minimal risk. Soviet commanders, by contrast, were trapped in a posture of perpetual response, their timelines dictated by an aircraft they did not control. Reports stacked up documenting identical outcomes, yet the obligation to respond remained. Over months and years, this asymmetry bled into broader strategic thinking. Resources were diverted toward countermeasures that promised hope but delivered little, while other priorities quietly suffered. The Blackbird did not just collect images. It reallocated attention, forcing an adversary to chase shadows while the Americans banked certainty. Beyond the immediate humiliation of failed intercepts lay a deeper consequence: the erosion of secrecy. Every successful SR-71 pass reduced the value of concealment. Missile sites were mapped, submarine movements inferred, infrastructure photographed, and changes detected with relentless regularity. The Soviets could move assets, camouflage installations, or alter schedules, but the tempo favored the observer. The knowledge that an unseen eye could return at any time altered behavior itself, encouraging caution where boldness might otherwise prevail. This was psychological leverage at scale, achieved without a single shot fired. The sky had become a surveillance corridor owned by one side alone. When the program's end approached, the contrast between perception and reality sharpened. Public explanations emphasized cost and changing technology, yet privately many understood that retirement did not equal replacement. No aircraft assumed the same mantle of speed, altitude, and invulnerability. Satellites offered persistence, drones offered deniability, but neither replicated the immediacy and certainty of a machine that could appear, observe, and depart within minutes. For adversaries, there was no moment of vindication, no downed aircraft to display, no victory to commemorate. The Blackbird exited on its own terms, leaving behind a record unmarred by enemy success. In the final accounting, the Senior 71's greatest achievement was not a number or a record, but a lesson delivered repeatedly and without exception. It proved that technological supremacy, once achieved and protected, can impose costs far beyond the battlefield. It can dictate schedules, redirect resources, and reshape doctrine inside an opponent's system. For the United States, the Blackbird embodied a confidence born of preparation and foresight. For those who watched it cross their screens and vanish, it embodied a hard truth of the Cold War. Some advantages are not meant to be contested, only endured. The presence of the SR-71 Blackbird reshaped daily life inside Soviet air defense units in ways rarely acknowledged outside classified reports. Scramble protocols evolved around a target everyone understood would never be intercepted. Sirens echoed across airbases, crews sprinted toward aircraft, engines ignited in disciplined urgency. Not because success was expected, but because the system demanded reaction. Over time, this ritual became corrosive. Pilots climbed knowing the outcome before their wheels left the runway. Each sortie consumed fuel, airframe life, and morale, returning nothing but confirmation of failure. The Blackbird transformed readiness itself into a psychological tax, forcing the Soviet system to expend resources repeatedly on a problem it could neither solve nor deter, turning vigilance into exhaustion and procedure into quiet humiliation. That constant obligation to respond created a profound strategic asymmetry. American planners controlled tempo, geography, and frequency, choosing precisely when and where to fly for maximum informational gain. Soviet commanders, by contrast, lived inside a reactive loop, their timelines dictated by an aircraft they could not influence. Reports accumulated, each one mirroring the last, documenting identical outcomes despite different crews, different weather, different launch angles. Over months and years, this imbalance quietly redirected priorities. Funding flowed toward countermeasures that promised hope but delivered none, while other programs absorbed the cost. The Blackbird did not merely observe the Soviet Union. It forced it to chase inevitability, bleeding attention and confidence without ever engaging directly. Beyond failed intercepts lay a deeper, more damaging consequence: the erosion of secrecy itself. Every successful SR-71 pass stripped away assumptions about protected airspace. Missile batteries were photographed, submarine movements inferred, infrastructure mapped, and operational changes detected with relentless precision. Assets could be moved, camouflage improved, schedules altered, yet the advantage always favored the observer. The knowledge that the Blackbird could return at any moment reshaped behavior, encouraging caution where decisiveness once prevailed. This was psychological pressure applied at national scale, achieved without bombs or dogfights, only with speed, altitude, and certainty. When retirement finally approached, the absence of triumph on the opposing side was telling. Public explanations spoke of cost and evolving technology, but there was no celebration, no declaration that the sky had been reclaimed. The aircraft was not replaced by an equal. It was simply withdrawn by choice. Satellites and drones assumed portions of its mission, yet none replicated the immediacy and invulnerability of a manned platform that could appear, gather intelligence, and vanish within minutes. The Blackbird left behind no wreckage for enemies to display, no victory to remember. It exited history the same way it crossed defended airspace, on its own terms, undefeated, leaving adversaries with nothing but unanswered alarms and the enduring realization that the contest had never been equal. Inside the cockpit, the burden of supremacy was carried by men operating at the edge of human tolerance. Flying the SR-71 Blackbird ** meant accepting an environment closer to space than to conventional aviation, where altitude erased margins and speed compressed time into unforgiving intervals. Pressure suits were not symbols of prestige, they were lifelines. At those heights, a minor system's failure would become fatal in seconds, and the crew understood that survival depended on discipline as much as engineering. Yet paradoxically, the aircraft rewarded precision with calm. At cruise, the Blackbird felt composed and stable, its systems harmonized by speed itself. The pilot's greatest fear was not interception, but deviation, any anomaly that might force deceleration and expose them to a threat that had never truly existed before. This dynamic forged an uncommon confidence. As long as the aircraft remained within its envelope, it was sovereign, and the men inside it knew they were operating beyond the reach of any adversary. Training reflected that reality. Selection was ruthless, attrition expected, and preparation exhaustive. Crews learned to read the aircraft like a language, recognizing subtle vibrations and tonal changes that signaled shifts in performance. Emergencies were not dramatic guesses. They were precise checklists executed at Mach 3, with consequences measured in seconds. This intimacy between pilot and machine was itself a form of power. It ensured that when the Blackbird appeared on radar screens across hostile territory, it did so not as a gamble, but as a controlled assertion. The knowledge that such flights were routine for American crews and still impossible to counter deepened the psychological wound on the other side. Superiority was no longer theoretical. It was practiced, rehearsed, and repeatable. As the Cold War matured, the SR-71's influence extended beyond immediate missions into the strategic psyche of an entire era. It taught adversaries that some advantages arrive fully formed and remain out of reach, regardless of effort. The aircraft did not merely exploit gaps in defenses. It defined new ceilings that others could not reach. Each successful sortie reinforced a hierarchy in the sky, one that redirected resources, shaped doctrine, and quietly altered decision-making. The Blackbird's greatest victories were invisible, choices not taken, risks avoided, and initiatives delayed because an unseen observer might already be overhead. This was deterrence by certainty, achieved without escalation. When the program ended, the absence of celebration from former adversaries spoke volumes. There was no trophy, no captured airframe, no moment of reversal to mark the close of a chapter. Retirement came by decision, not defeat, leaving behind a legacy untouched by enemy success. Decades later, the records still stand, the capabilities remain unmatched, and the lesson endures. The SR-71 proved that technological sovereignty, once achieved, can shape history without firing a shot. It transformed the sky into a statement, and in doing so, it delivered one of the most enduring psychological victories of the Cold War, one written not in debris or declarations, but in speed, altitude, and the silence that followed every failed attempt to stop it. At the core of the aircraft's dominance lay a set of decisions that rewrote the rules of propulsion and endurance, choices that rendered conventional counters irrelevant. The SR-71 Blackbird was not constrained by the logic that governed other jets. It thrived on speed rather than suffering from it. Its engines were designed to become more efficient as velocity increased, shifting the balance of thrust so dramatically that cruising at extreme Mach numbers was not a strain but a state of equilibrium. This inverted logic crushed the defender's timeline. Missiles depended on prediction, interceptors depended on climb. Both depended on reaction windows that the Blackbird erased by design. Even fuel strategy reinforced this advantage. The aircraft launched light, refueled immediately, then converted speed into safety, stretching range through a choreography of tankers and timing that only one side could coordinate. For those tracking it from the ground, the realization was bitter. The problem was not a single component to counter, but an entire system optimized to outrun response itself. This systemic superiority extended into how the aircraft saw the world. The Blackbird sensors were not passive accessories. They were the point of the mission. Cameras resolved fine detail from altitudes that mocked traditional air defense, and they did so while the aircraft crossed miles in seconds. To make this possible, engineers solved a paradox few had even articulated: how to capture sharp images from a platform moving faster than a rifle bullet. The answer was not brute force, but elegance. Compensation mechanisms that moved with precision against the aircraft's motion, freezing moments the enemy assumed were unobservable. Each roll of film returned with clarity that stripped camouflage of meaning and exposed patterns thought invisible. Intelligence did not arrive days later. It arrived with urgency, reshaping decisions while opportunities still existed. For adversaries, the humiliation deepened as secrecy itself proved temporary. What followed was an arms race defined less by capability than by desperation. Soviet design bureaus pushed interceptors and missiles toward theoretical limits, unveiling aircraft that promised answers in headlines while failing quietly in practice. On paper, speed approached parity. In the air, the gap persisted. The Blackbird's altitude compressed reaction time so severely that even near matches arrived too late. Crews trained for perfect intercept geometry that reality refused to grant. Each failed attempt hardened an uncomfortable truth inside classified assessments. Catching the Blackbird required not better pilots or braver crews, but a rewrite of physics that no timetable could deliver. The result was a cycle of announcement and disappointment, confidence asserted publicly and eroded privately as the sky continued to favor the observer. Meanwhile, the Americans refined routine. Missions were planned with an understanding of enemy thresholds, flown to test margins, and repeated to confirm conclusions. There was no need to gamble. When conditions demanded it, crews could push beyond published limits, trading heat margins for survival with confidence born of preparation. This asymmetry, one side improvising against inevitability, the other executing rehearsed excellence, defined the psychological landscape of the contest. Over time, it influenced choices far beyond aviation. Resources shifted, doctrine softened, and caution replaced initiative where an unseen witness might already be overhead. The Blackbird did not just win encounters, it shaped behavior. It proved that dominance could be maintained by arriving first, leaving last, and ensuring the opponent always learned too late. The paradox of the Blackbird's legend is that its greatest vulnerabilities never came from the enemy it so thoroughly dominated. While thousands of missiles failed to touch it, the aircraft lived at the edge of materials science, where heat, vibration, and time were unforgiving arbiters. At sustained Mach 3, temperatures climbed to levels that transformed metal behavior, expanding panels, stressing seals, and demanding constant vigilance. When failures occurred, they arrived without drama and without mercy, compressing decision-making into seconds. Crews understood this reality intimately. They did not fear interception. They respected physics. This distinction mattered because it underscored the humiliation inflicted on adversaries. Even when the Blackbird was lost, it was never taken. Mechanical limits might claim an airframe, but no hostile weapon ever did. The enemy remained a spectator to losses it could not cause. These incidents forged a culture of precision rather than recklessness. Maintenance became ritualized excellence, inspections exhaustive, tolerances exacting. Each flight required a choreography of specialists, data loads, and checks that reflected the aircraft's singular nature. When mishaps occurred, investigations led not to abandonment, but to refinement, tightening procedures and strengthening confidence. The result was a platform that grew safer with experience, even as it continued to operate where mistakes were intolerable. For opponents, the lesson was bitterly consistent. Despite attrition, despite risk, the Blackbird's dominance persisted. The sky did not become contested when an aircraft was lost. It remained unclaimed when the next one launched and completed its mission unchallenged. If accidents revealed the cost of operating at extremes, records revealed the payoff. The SR-71 Blackbird set benchmarks that have endured for decades, achievements that quietly mocked every attempt at comparison. Speed records, altitude records, coast-to-coast times, transatlantic crossings, Each became a testament not to a single flight, but to a capability that could be repeated on demand. These were not stunt performances. They were byproducts of routine operations. The message to adversaries was implicit and unrelenting. What looked extraordinary was simply how the aircraft lived. The endurance of these records deepened the psychological imbalance. Programs came and went, budgets swelled and shrank, yet no successor surpassed the Blackbird's combination of speed, altitude, and survivability. Its retirement did not invalidate its achievements. It froze them in place, unbroken. For years afterward, comparisons continued to be drawn, always ending at the same conclusion. The Blackbird remained the ceiling. In a conflict defined by perception as much as power, that permanence mattered. It told the world that American technological leaps were not fleeting advantages, but durable transformations, advantages that, once established, did not require constant proof. They simply stood unchallenged, as the sky itself seemed to remember who had mastered it first. As the Cold War advanced into its later decades, an uncomfortable question began to surface within both camps, though only one side could ask it with confidence. What comes after something that has already outrun the future? For all the money spent, for all the aircraft unveiled and missiles advertised, there was no direct successor to the SR-71 Blackbird ***. Satellites promised persistence, drones promised deniability, and newer platforms promised efficiency. Yet none combined immediacy, flexibility, and invulnerability in a single manned system. The Blackbird had occupied a narrow summit where speed itself was protection and altitude was sovereignty. That summit remained empty after it departed. For adversaries, this absence was not relief. It was a reminder. The aircraft had not been replaced because it had not been surpassed. It had been set aside because strategy evolved, not because dominance eroded. This reality sharpened the psychological contrast that had defined the program from the start. American planners could afford to move on, confident that the knowledge gained and the standards set would endure. Opponents were left with a lingering deficit, decades spent reacting to a machine they never solved. Even as technology marched forward, the Blackbird's unique profile remained unmatched. Its records intact, its reputation undiminished. In intelligence circles, its name continued to serve as a benchmark, a shorthand for what happens when engineering ambition aligns with strategic clarity. The lesson, quietly absorbed, was that some advantages cannot be chased indefinitely. They arrive once, reshape the field, and then stand as reference points rather than targets. When the SR-71 was finally withdrawn from service, the manner of its departure spoke louder than any ceremony. There was no adversarial victory to acknowledge, no intercepted wreckage to display, no closing chapter written by an enemy's hand. The aircraft left on schedule, by decision, its mission set fulfilled. For those who had spent careers trying to counter it, this ending offered no catharsis. The sky was not reclaimed. It was simply quieter. The absence of celebration on the opposing side was telling, an unspoken admission that the contest had ended without reversal. In the years that followed, the Blackbird's silhouette migrated from runways to museums, where it inspired awe rather than fear. Yet even in repose, it continued to project a message forged at Mach 3. Visitors stood beneath its dark skin and struggled to reconcile its age with its performance, realizing that a machine conceived in the 1960s still defined the limits of atmospheric flight. That realization carried weight beyond nostalgia. It reaffirmed the central truth of the Cold War era. Supremacy achieved through preparation and foresight does not require constant reaffirmation. It endures. The SR-71 did not need a final victory to validate its legacy. Its uninterrupted record, untouched, unmatched, and unanswered, had already done that, leaving behind a silence as powerful as the one it once carved across hostile skies. With time, the Blackbird escaped the confines of classified files and entered the wider American imagination, not as a relic, but as a symbol of what disciplined ambition could achieve. Long after its engines fell silent, its silhouette continued to project confidence, sleek, uncompromising, and unapologetically ahead of its era. Veterans spoke of it with reverence, engineers with quiet pride, and the public with awe. The aircraft came to represent a moment when the United States chose not to match an adversary step for step, but to redefine the race entirely. In museums, crowds gathered beneath its dark skin and confronted a dissonant truth. A machine conceived with slide rules and drafted on paper still defied the upper limits of atmospheric flight. That realization reinforced a cultural narrative central to the American experience of the Cold War, that ingenuity, when paired with resolve, could deliver advantages so decisive they would outlast the conflict itself. This cultural impact fed back into strategy in subtle ways. The Blackbird story became a reference point inside defense planning, a reminder that breakthroughs do not emerge from incrementalism alone. It validated a philosophy that accepted risk in pursuit of decisive margins, trusting that preparation would tame danger. For adversaries who studied it after the fact, the lesson was uncomfortable. The gap they had chased for decades had not been accidental. It had been intentional, cultivated, and protected. The humiliation was not merely historical. It persisted as a benchmark that newer programs were measured against and rarely met. In that sense, the Blackbird continued to shape expectations long after it stopped flying, its presence lingering as a standard others struggled to reach. Strategically, the closing chapter of the SR-71 program underscored a final imbalance. As reconnaissance shifted toward satellites and unmanned systems, the decision to retire the aircraft reflected confidence rather than retreat. The knowledge it had gathered was already embedded in doctrine, the advantages it had delivered already banked. There was no scramble to replace it with an equal, because the strategic environment no longer demanded that particular expression of dominance. For the other side, this transition offered no consolation. They had not forced the change, they had endured it. The aircraft's departure marked the end of an era without granting the satisfaction of a contest resolved. In retrospect, this ending may have been the most psychologically decisive of all. The Blackbird did not fade after being challenged. It stepped aside after proving its point beyond dispute. Its legacy became one of controlled inevitability, a demonstration that some contests conclude not with victory parades, but with quiet acceptance. As the Cold War receded into history, the lessons remained stark. Superiority achieved through foresight alters behavior, reallocates resources, and shapes outcomes without requiring confrontation. The SR-71 embodied that truth in motion, turning speed and altitude into instruments of influence. Even grounded, it continued to speak for itself, leaving adversaries with the same conclusion they had reached decades earlier while watching it vanish from their screens. The advantage had never been theirs to take. In the final analysis, the true measure of the Blackbird's impact was never confined to engineering metrics or operational statistics. It resided in the collective awareness of those who opposed it, an understanding forged through repetition and failure that altered expectations at every level of command. The SR-71 Blackbird taught a hard lesson. Superiority is most decisive when it denies the opponent meaningful choice. Soviet commanders could react, but reaction was all they had. They could invest, but investment arrived late. They could threaten, but threats dissolved in the thin air above interception envelopes. Over time, this asymmetry recalibrated behavior. Confirmations replaced challenges, caution replaced initiative, and the assumption of vulnerability gave way to resignation. The humiliation was not loud or theatrical. It was methodical, cumulative, and inescapable, delivered flight after flight as the aircraft appeared, observed, and departed untouched. This realization rippled beyond aviation into the broader psychology of the Cold War. It reinforced the notion that some advantages, once established, impose costs simply by existing. The Blackbird did not need to demonstrate force. It demonstrated inevitability. Its presence rewrote timelines, forced reallocations, and imposed a ceiling on ambition. For American planners, this was the quiet dividend of foresight, a return on years of investment that paid out in certainty. For adversaries, it was an enduring constraint, a reminder that the contest had been decided in places they could not reach and at speeds they could not match. The story closes not with a chase or a final confrontation, but with a silence earned through dominance. When the Blackbird left the skies, it did so undefeated, unchallenged, and unreversed. No opposing narrative emerged to counter its legacy, no victory to claim in its absence. What remained were records intact, doctrines altered, and memories shaped by the knowledge that the sky had once been controlled so completely by one side that resistance became ritual rather than remedy. This is the rarest form of victory in warfare, the kind that concludes without a final battle because the outcome has long been accepted. Today, the Blackbird stands still, its engines cold, its mission complete, yet the message endures. It speaks of a moment when ambition met preparation, when engineering transcended expectation, and when power was expressed not through destruction, but through certainty. In the long arc of the Cold War, the SR-71 became more than an aircraft. It became a statement written across the upper atmosphere, legible to all who tried and failed to contest it. The sky remembers that statement. And so does history.